Dissecting the SHAC campaign. I'm not sure that my talk is going to make me very popular, so please be nice. Reflection on the SHAC campaign since it ended has largely focused on how successful it was and how unfortunate it is that the campaign ended. And I agree that there were some major accomplishments. Namely, we put the vivisection industry on the defensive, we forced massive corporations to bend to our will, and most importantly, we mobilized activists and we reinvigorated a movement. There have also been critiques of shortcomings within SHAC. They've included things like some of the actions in the campaign crossed an ethical line, criticism of the tough guy nature of the campaign, acknowledgement that we were clearly mistaken in our belief that we were untouchable and corporations and government could never stop us, and that there was insufficient infrastructure to deal with the imprisonment of the campaign's leaders. There was essentially no one to take the wheel. And I think that there are validity to all of these critiques. But they all focus on what went wrong in terms of the downfall of the campaign. And the underlying assumption is that it would have been better if SHAC had continued and closed HLS. But I want to focus on a different question. I want to critique the SHAC model of success itself. I want to ask, what if we had won? What if SHAC had closed HLS? What might have been the shortcomings of that? It's something I've been thinking about ever since a conversation that I had with an activist a few years ago. He was working on a SHAC-style campaign, and he wanted my guidance. He told me he had so many questions for me, and I was really flattered. Basically, he wanted to know how to run a SHAC-style campaign in a post-SHAC 7 world, how to harness the campaign's successes and avoid its shortcomings and ultimately its downfall. He had questions about how to pressure corporate executives, how I would conduct home demonstrations, what kind of rhetoric to use, basically how to apply pressure but avoid indictment. And as he asked them, I mostly answered that I wasn't really thinking about SHAC-style campaigning these days, so I didn't really have ideas on that. But he was persistent and he kept asking, and finally he looked at me point blank and he said, what if you were? What if you were specifically focused on pressuring a particular corporation to cede to your demands? What would you do then? And I had to tell him, I wouldn't do that again. That, of course, was the SHAC model. And it's become gospel in certain circles of grassroots animal rights that we should do it again, that we should narrow our focus, use so-called pressure tactics, and measure our success solely by the effect we have on our target. The thing is, when we narrowed our focus to HLS during the SHAC campaign, we didn't narrow the problem. Global meat consumption continues to rise. More animals are used in vivisection in the US and globally than they were 15 years ago. Fur continues to make its long comeback, and habitat destruction and species extinction are accelerating. While we were measuring the decimating effects of SHAC on HLS's finances, we weren't paying attention to these. Now, I don't know how animal liberation will come about. I don't know if animal liberation will come about. But it seems to me that if we are to get at the problem that violence against animals is increasing, at minimum, certain things will have to happen. We will have to have a widespread and probably contentious public debate about speciesism. We will have to see watershed events, including massive public provocation on the scale of something like Occupy Wall Street or other movements we've seen doing this in recent years. We will have to see not just an increase in the prevalence and acceptance of veganism, but increased social disapproval and even condemnation of eating, wearing, and otherwise using animals. And we will have to see a movement aimed not just at changing a particular institution, but at transforming a society. I don't see how we can change the world for animals without these things. And I don't think SHAC was building towards them. Instead, we prompted a public debate about tactics and about how tough SHAC was. We didn't bother trying to build public pressure. I famously did a radio interview in which I basically said, nobody gets off their ass for animals anyway, so we don't care at all what anybody thinks of us. We're going to do this ourselves. And I just want to say that I am not suggesting that we need people to respond positively in the immediate to our protests. And if you want to hear more about that, you can come to my talk tomorrow. I conceived of SHAC as completely separate from addressing issues like eating animals. My vision of changing the world for animals was that pressure campaigns like SHAC would take out labs and animal circuses one by one, and making vegans one by one would yield a massive boycott that would magically abolish animal agriculture. I had no conception of change on a societal scale. I think that some of the components of the SHAC campaign, often praised as its virtues, were actually drawbacks. And I'm going to talk about 3 of them. The first was an exceedingly narrow focus on a single target. The second was a fetishization of pressure tactics. And the third was a hyper-focus on short-term effects. On the first point, our narrow focus on HLS. This is often deemed the most strategic feature of SHAC. But because our only metric of success was our direct impact on HLS, we didn't think deeply about SHAC's role in a broader movement. It includes that we didn't think much about whether building a strong movement outside of SHAC was important or whether we were contributing to it. When I thought about movement building back then, I thought only about building a campaign that could be turned on other companies after HLS closed. This was a kind of tunnel vision, a razor focus on HLS, that I think had us lose sight of whether we were contributing to a broader long-term goal. And our immediate effects on a specific target don't necessarily indicate that we're contributing to long-term change for animals. Our narrow focus also on a single target also largely determined what tactics we used, which brings me to my second point, a fetishization of pressure campaigns. Because our mechanism of change was direct pressure, forcing change because a campaign is intolerable to the target, we had an incentive to not consider the secondary effects of tactics. Direct pressure was obviously highly effective against HLS, but I don't think it was highly effective for the animal rights movement overall, which had a lot to do with narrative. SHAC worked because when a company or an executive got a letter about HLS, that letter didn't stand on its own. It invoked much more. It invoked a narrative about harassment, property damage, and siege mentality. That narrative was intrinsic to SHAC's success. It is why multinational corporations bent to our will. And because we were only measuring our effect on HLS, there was little reason not to make our narrative about smashed windows and sunken yachts. Doing so made us more effective. The thing is, unless we can harass and smash our way to animal liberation, which, to be clear, I would be all for if I thought it would work, then that narrative isn't very helpful to our more fundamental project. Now, I am not saying that SHAC harmed the movement overall. I do not believe that. But because the impact of the SHAC strategy and tactics on HLS was so apparent, so dramatic, so enthralling, I fear that SHAC has led to a fetishization of pressure campaigning. Which brings me to the third thing, our hyper-focus on direct impact and short-term effects. We focused on direct short-term impact to HLS to the neglect of less apparent and less measurable, but perhaps more fundamental indicators of social change. Now, this is not a problem that is limited to the SHAC campaign. It is a problem in our movement. But regarding the SHAC campaign, that was its main appeal. Our short-term effects were highly measurable, exceedingly obvious, and they provided immediate gratification. We could see the effects of our actions. You pick a target, harass its executives, smash up their stuff, they divest from HLS, HLS takes a hit. Clearly it was working because we could see it. The problem is that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. When we focus on measurables and direct short-term impacts simply because they are easy to see, it is as though we are looking for our lost keys under the lamppost because that is where the light is, even if it's not where we lost them. In short, you can't always see change happening. And I think we need to consider the possibility that the very ways in which SHAC was successful are also ways in which it failed to contribute to long-term change for animals. Ultimately, I think that the primary shortcoming of SHAC is that the model itself is designed to have immediate short-term effects on a campaign target and not to contribute to an overall anti-speciesism movement, to yield those things that seem like they must happen if we are to change the world for animals. The problem is that the things I've suggested we will need to see if we're going to make that change are really hard to measure. How do you measure things that will prompt a widespread public debate about speciesism? How do you measure the things that get you to those watershed events, those massive public provocations? How do you deal with the fact that you may have to start with very small actions in order to build towards that? How do you transform something like meat eating from being socially acceptable to being socially offensive? I don't have a list of answers for you, and I'm trying to raise more questions than provide answers. But I think we start by letting go of our need for immediate short-term effects, our need to measure everything. We have to become comfortable with signs that indicate change, but are not necessarily proximately causing it. Things like, are we prompting press coverage that is talking about the fundamental animal rights issues? Are we provoking other people to chime in and comment on our efforts or on animal rights in op-eds, blogs, and other opinion venues, positively or negatively? Are we provoking a debate that moves beyond the current consensus? Are we bringing new activists in and empowering them to speak up for animals? Are we building an infrastructure that will support a movement for the next 10, 20, 30 years? Are we engaging in behavior that we want to normalize? Are we doing what we ultimately want to see people doing regarding violence against animals? If we are outraged at people eating animals, are we acting outraged ourselves? To be clear, I am not inherently opposed to targeted campaigns. SHAC was a very specific recipe of target strategy and tactics. And I do think that specific targets are helpful to illustrate the problem, making a broader point about the fundamental issue. And an example that I'll use are welfare campaigns. I am a known critic of many aspects of welfare campaigns. However, it is a misperception that I am against them in their entirety. One specific point of praise is that this has been a systemic attack. Those who are running welfare campaigns have used companies, and lots of them, to show that the entire system is bad. The welfare narrative is that factory farming is bad overall, and we need reforms overall. And I think we need to do something similar with a stronger message. Not about abuse or cruelty, but about violence against animals, about animal rights and animal liberation, and we need to shift the debate. Nor am I categorically opposed to home demonstrations, vandalism, or other SHAC tactics. But I do think we need to make sure that our campaigns, our strategies, and our tactics are focused not solely on their proximate impact on the target, but on whether we are building towards long-term social change for animals, whether we are inching towards those things that I listed that it seems we must see if we are ever to change the world for animals. None of this is to denigrate SHAC for what it was at the time. I still think we needed something like SHAC back then. I just don't think we need it now. The movement and the world were very different back then. And I think that they've changed in ways from social media to the existing animal welfare narrative to a culture of protest that means that we can do something different now. SHAC is one of the proudest things I have ever done. Joining the campaign is among the best decisions I have made in my life. And I have very fond memories of organizing and hanging out with Kevin and other people. And I don't mean to diminish that. And I don't think we need to diminish it. We can respect SHAC for what it was at the time. And at the same time, we can critique it. And we can recognize that we need to let it rest and move on. We can be brave enough, creative enough, curious enough, and visionary enough that we can think outside the SHAC box. Thank you.